The first time I laid eyes on Crestwood Lake, it was love at first sight. The water stretched like polished glass under a canopy of whispering pines. And my only neighbours were deer and the occasional osprey. I bought the land on a handshakes deal from an old trapper who'd inherited it, built my one-room cabin by hand, and for 13 years, it stayed exactly as I needed it, silent, sacred, mine. But time is a thief. The developers came first, then the realtors, then the retirees, with golf carts and golden retrievers named Winston. They paved roads, installed wrought iron gates, and called it Crestwood Shores, lakeside luxury living, where my cabin stood in proud solitude. Pastel-colored mansions now loomed. The lake I once had to myself became a backdrop for brunches and paddleboard yoga. I tolerated it until the Homeowners Association formed. At first, it seemed like a bad joke. The HOA couldn't possibly apply to me. My land deed was older than their bylaws. I wasn't part of their subdivision. I had no intention of following their paint codes or mailbox standards. Then I met Cynthia Hargrave. She introduced herself on a summer afternoon with the smile of a politician and the eyes of a hawk. Slim, impeccably dressed in tennis whites, she walked right up my gravel path and handed me a folder. "Welcome to the community," she said, as if I hadn't lived there a decade before she arrived. "We're streamlining lakefront aesthetics to protect property values. We'd love your cooperation." I opened the folder. Inside was a list of required upgrades, from replacing my cedar siding with HOA-approved vinyl to removing unsightly wood piles that were, in fact, seasoned firewood. "I'm not part of the HOA," I said, closing the folder and handing it back. She didn't take it. "We're expanding to include all lake-adjacent properties," she said coolly. "It's a community effort." I didn't argue. People like Cynthia don't respond to logic. They respond to leverage. I didn't think she had any. I was wrong. A week later, a chain was bolted across the main trail, leading to the public dock, a dock I'd used for years. A new sign hung from it. HOA access only. All others will be prosecuted. I thought it was a bluff. I stepped over the chain with my fishing gear and hiked down to the lake. As I cast my line into the water, I heard the crunch of gravel behind. Me, an HOA volunteer, clipboard in hand, camera slung around his neck like a badge, approached me with the authority of a mall cop. "You're trespassing," he said. "This dock's been public for 20 years. Trail's HOA land now. You'll need to file for permitted access after your property meets code." He snapped a picture of me, then my license plate. The next day, I received a notice of violation for unauthorized lake use. I ignored it. Then came the fines, $100, then $250, each stacked with bureaucratic precision. My attorney laughed when I called. "They can't fine you," he said. "You're not a member." "Then why are they allowed to block the trail?" He hesitated. "Because the trail runs through their parcel. It's technically their land." Now, that was when it hit me. They weren't just trying to enforce rules. They were trying to erase me. My rustic cabin didn't fit their curated lakefront fantasy. To them, I was the final blemish on an otherwise polished brochure. Cynthia wasn't interested in coexisting. She wanted compliance or elimination, and she had the power to isolate me from the lake entirely. I tried to rally other residents, but they were either apathetic or afraid of rocking the boat. Cynthia had her claws deep into the community, social, events, vendor contracts, even local law enforcement. She had connections. I was one man with a cabin, a fishing rod, and a deepening fury. Then came the 4th of July. As I prepared for my annual barbecue, brisket smoking, coolers packed, fireworks, stacked neatly on the porch. Another letter arrived. This time it was hand-delivered by a man in a blazer who looked more like a funeral director than a courier. Effective immediately, Parcel 17B is restricted from all lake access pending compliance review. Continued use may result in legal action. Parcel 17, full. That was me. They'd stripped me of access to the lake I'd built my life around. Not by law, but by bureaucracy. Not with chains, but with paper and pressure. And just like that, I realized the truth. They thought I'd go quietly. I stood at the edge of my property that night, watching fireworks explode over the water I could no longer touch. My hands clenched, not with helplessness, but with purpose. If they wanted to play power games, they were about to learn something crucial. I don't lose on my own land. The morning after the 4th, I poured my coffee black and bitter, then pulled out every legal document I owned. Deeds, maps, county plats, surveyor records. If Cynthia Hargrave and her HOA empire wanted to push me off this land with paperwork, then I'd return the favor. Only, I'd do it smarter, deeper. That's when I saw it. The original lake deed. Most people don't realize lakes are often a patchwork of ownership. Shorelines, water rights, access routes. In my case, the old trapper who sold me the land had included a curious clause buried in the paperwork. It granted me riparian rights and shared use access over a large portion of Crestwood Lake. The catch: the deed referenced rights that extended beyond just the visible shoreline, deep into the lake bed and subsoil of the western end, the very side the HOA had claimed for its exclusive use. I drove straight to the county records office, where a sleepy clerk named Harold thumbed through dusty files until he pulled out the original lake plat, yellowed and brittle. My finger traced the boundaries. "You're telling me that's my section?" I asked, tapping the western inlet. He nodded. "Yup. Looks like the HOA owns shoreline, but not the water itself in that portion. That's you." It took every ounce of restraint not to smile. That afternoon, I hired a land use attorney, one of those scrappy underdog types who enjoyed nothing more than tormenting arrogant boards with delusions of grandeur. Her name was Rhea Patel, and she wore sharp suits and sharper smirks. "They messed up," she said after one review. "Badly. They annexed trail access through their parcels, but assumed the lake section was theirs too. But this," she tapped my deed, "this makes you a majority water rights holder. Can I get my access back?" She leaned back. "You can do more than that. You can own the whole damn lake if you want." I blinked. "What?" "Half of these HOA homes have no riparian rights. The other parcels have gaps in the records. Some of it's never even been registered properly. If we buy up the missing segments, we can consolidate lake control under one title." My breath caught. "You mean I could buy the lake?" She nodded. "And once you do, they'll need your permission to swim, fish, or even dock their kayaks." The plan was risky, expensive, and complicated. But every injustice they'd thrown at me made the decision easier. I mortgaged a secondary property. I sold a vintage truck I'd been restoring for years. Rhea created an LLC so anonymous it made the IRS nervous. Then we went shopping. Over the next few months, I quietly acquired odd parcels, the forgotten dock rights of a long-deceased farmer, the tiny half-acre slivers that no developer cared to consolidate, the inlet curves no one knew were privately owned. I even purchased the mineral rights beneath one end of the lake just to guarantee full vertical control. The kicker: several of the parcels were held in tax default. All I had to do was pay the overdue bills and file the proper claims. Cynthia didn't notice. The HOA was too busy planning their annual lakeside gala. By early spring, Ria handed me a thick binder. "You're now the legal owner of over 62% of Crestwood Lake's usable surface area," she said. "The HOA has no dominion over your section. In fact, they're now trespassing." I stood on my dock that evening, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The water shimmered with potential. They tried to ban me from the lake. Now I was the lake. But I wasn't done. The true revenge wouldn't be locking them out. It would be showing them what real value looked like. The lake had always been a sanctuary. Now, it would become something else entirely. A business. The idea came to me when I watched a group of teenagers haul out buckets and pans from the creek, running into my section of the lake. They were panning for gold, partly a joke, partly tradition. Laughed at first, until one of them held up a glinting flake. Gold. The lake fed off a tributary that ran down from old abandoned mining grounds. I started researching, testing sediment, consulting with small-scale dredging outfits. The results? Enough flake and fine gold dust to justify a full permit application. I didn't need to block Cynthia. I just needed to let her realize, too late, that the lake she tried to weaponize was now a literal gold mine. And she didn't own a drop of it. The permits went through. The drilling rigs arrived in April, and the HOA's panic began. By the time the first mining barge anchored on the western inlet, the HOA's pristine illusion began to splinter. It wasn't a massive operation. Nothing like the industrial rigs people imagined when they heard gold mine. Just a few floating platforms with suction dredges and filtration units. Quiet, legal, and surprisingly lucrative. The crew I'd hired, local prospectors with clean records and quiet efficiency, worked dawn to dusk, scooping lakebed sediment and filtering it. For flakes, dust, and occasional nuggets, Cynthia Hargrave's morning walks now included an extra detour down the trail overlooking my section of the lake. Sunglasses perched low as she peered across the water at my operation with barely disguised fury. "A week into the mining," she finally snapped. She marched up to the trailhead where my crew parked their trucks, a folded clipboard tucked under her arm like a saber. I was leaning against my truck, sipping coffee, when she approached. "You need to cease this immediately," she said, her voice tight with outrage. "Good morning, Cynthia," I replied calmly. "Lovely day for entrepreneurship." "This is a residential community," she hissed. "You're violating noise ordinances, disturbing the lake ecosystem, and creating an eyesore." "Funny," I said, glancing at the binder in her hand. "You didn't mention any of that when you tried to block my lake access." She blinked. "Turns out," I continued, "those same HOA rules you love to quote don't apply to lake owners operating on private parcels." I checked. She recovered quickly. "Then I'll go to the county. They'll shut this down. The community will not stand for this kind of gold extraction." I smiled. "Totally permitted. Every inch above board." I filed environmental, impact assessments, work permits, noise mitigation. Ria Patel made sure of it. "If you'd like a tour, I can have a hard hat and waiver ready." She turned scarlet. "You think you're clever. I think I'm thorough." That afternoon, the HOA sent a blast email to all residents warning of unsanctioned industrial activity at the lake. But the thing about money, it talks louder than fear. By the end of the month, news of the gold spread beyond Crestwood. Shores, a local business journal, ran a feature. "Hidden Gold Rush. Small town man strikes at big and forgotten lake." The photo showed me holding a small vial of dust, grinning like a fool. And that grin, more than the gold itself, set Cynthia's Phone lines ablaze. Because suddenly everyone wanted in. Offers started trickling in from lakefront homeowners. How do I buy in? One asked during a town hall. Can we lease our shorelines to the operation? Asked another. I've got land on the northern edge. Willing to sell. Someone else added. Cynthia tried to hold the line. She called an emergency HOA board meeting. I wasn't invited, but Ria was. She held up a single-page statement. Lakebed rights are not subject to HOA jurisdiction. All commercial activities are fully permitted and legally sound. A week later, a new sign went up at the lake. Crestwood Lake Mineral Cooperative. Private members. Only mining observation tours. Available by appointment. Investment inquiries. Welcome. People who once avoided me at HOA cookouts were now dropping off homemade pies, offering business tips, even asking about summer jobs for their teenagers. A retired couple from Lot 14 offered me their aluminum dock in exchange for a percentage share. Cynthia was unraveling. She filed 2 cease and desist orders, both denied. She even staged a Protect Our Lake protest with 10 people holding signs that read, "Our lake, not a mine." But when local news interviewed them and asked how much of the lake the HOA actually owned, Cynthia went silent. The answer was, barely a third. Her own board started turning against her. Donations to the HOA dried up. Contractors stopped returning her calls. Someone even started a petition to remove her as president. But I wasn't finished. I had one more surprise. At the next open board meeting, I walked in wearing a clean button-up and carrying a single manila envelope. Cynthia froze. Her voice faltered. "I'd like to speak," I said. She tried to object, but the board waved me forward. I handed them the envelope. Inside was a formal offer. My LLC was prepared to purchase the remaining 38% of Crestwood Lake for double the year. Assessed value, contingent on full mineral, recreational, and water access rights. Silence hung in the air. "I know many of you moved here for peace and beauty," I said. "This offer gives you both, profits and access, without bureaucracy. Let me turn this lake into something that benefits all of us, not just those with control issues." I didn't look at Cynthia. I didn't need to. She knew she'd lost, and the vote was coming. The vote took place on a humid Thursday evening inside the Crestwood Shores Community Hall, a place that once echoed with the smug assurance of HOA dominance. Now the air was thick with uncertainty. Residents packed the room, some drawn by a curiosity, others by the scent of opportunity. Cynthia Hargrave sat stiffly at the front table, flanked by the remaining loyalists of her shrinking regime. Her posture was regal, but her eyes betrayed the cracks in her confidence. Ria and I stood near the back, calm, patient. This wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. When the time came, a board member named Alan stepped up to the podium, a retired geologist. Alan had once been Cynthia's staunchest ally. Tonight, he cleared his throat and unfolded a sheet of paper. Tonight's vote, he began, concerns the sale of remaining Crestwood Lake holdings to the Crestwood Mineral Cooperative, an entity managed by Mr. Sawyer Kane. Murmurs rippled across the room. Some people leaned in. Others looked away from Cynthia's frozen expression. Alan continued, "The offer includes fair market value plus a 100% premium. It also stipulates that public access for residents will remain unchanged. All current dock rights will be honoured. The difference is, control moves from HOA hands to a cooperative trust, open to investment and profit sharing by lakefront homeowners." A pause. Then, all in favour, hands shot up, one by one, row by row. I counted quietly. 28, 34, 42. Cynthia's hand stayed down. alone, the vote passed by an overwhelming margin. It was done. I was now the sole majority owner of Crestwood Lake, with control consolidated, mineral rights intact, and a board of trustees assembled to oversee the cooperative in a transparent, democratic fashion. For the first time in years, Crestwood Shores belonged to its people, not to the ego of one tyrant. Cynthia stood as if in a trance. Her voice cracked. This is a mistake, she murmured. You're giving away order for chaos. He's not one of us. He never was. Alan turned toward her, his tone gentle but final. He is now. She stormed out without another word. 2 weeks later, Cynthia's house went up for sale. A quiet for sale by owner sign appeared on the trimmed lawn of her colonial-style estate. No open house, no farewell, just silence. Meanwhile, the lake transformed. I expanded operations with respect for the environment. We installed floating greenhouses near the inlet to purify water runoff. I brought in local schools for geology field trips and science workshops. The Crestwood Lake Mineral Cooperative began paying quarterly dividends to its members, each homeowner receiving a small check for their share of the operation's success. And something incredible happened. People stopped locking their docks. Barbecues returned to the shore. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years traded stories about gold flakes and childhood swims. The lake became more than a battleground. It became a bond. I never bragged, never gloated, but on a quiet Sunday, while I was out in my boat testing a new filtration pump, a young boy waved to me from the HOA's old beach area. You the lake guy, he called out. I nodded. My dad says you saved the neighborhood. I smiled. Tell your dad it was teamwork. He grinned, then tossed a rock into the water. Later that night, Rhea and I stood on the dock, watching the last sliver of sun dip beneath the horizon. The water shimmered gold, not just from sediment, but from something deeper. A hard-won peace. You ever think it'd end like this? She asked. No, I said. But I'm glad it did. She raised an eyebrow. So, what now? I looked out over the water, our water, and thought about the future. Well, I said, I heard there's silver deposits in the Northern Creek. Might be worth exploring. She laughed. The lake had given me everything I never asked for. Conflict, injustice, revelation, redemption. But more than that, it had reminded me of something I'd forgotten during the fight. True power isn't about control. It's about stewardship. And in the end, I didn't just reclaim my cabin. I reclaimed a legacy, Crestwood. Lake was no longer a battlefield. It was a goldmine of second chances.